The cold came early that year to Harlan County, Tennessee. Not the kind of cold that sneaks up on you gradual, the kind that eases in around mid-October and gives you time to pull out the heavy quilts and stack firewood on the porch before the real weather sets in. No, this cold came like a door slamming shut. Third week of November and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 18 hours. The sky went white, the roads went glassy, and by the time the sun set on a Tuesday evening, the whole eastern stretch of Route 9 was nothing but frozen ruts and wind that cut right through whatever you thought you were wearing. Ruth Holden had seen 72 Tennessee winters, and she knew what this one was telling her. She was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of chamomile tea going cold in her hands, watching the tree line across the south field bend and shake in the gusts. The big oak Harold had planted the year they married was still standing. 47 years, that tree. She'd watched it from this window through every season, every storm, every dry summer, and wet spring through the years when the children were small and the house was loud, and through the quiet years after, when it was just her and Harold and the sound of the radio and the creek running behind the barn. Harold had been gone 4 years now. The house was just her and the radio now. She was not a woman who complained about solitude. She had grown into it the way you grow into a pair of boots that don't quite fit at first, but eventually shape themselves around you. She had her garden in the summer, her preserves in the fall, her church on Sundays in May Weaver 3 miles down the road, who called every evening at 7 whether Ruth needed it or not. She had her medical book still stacked on the shelf in the back bedroom. Dog-eared and spine-cracked from 31 years as a registered nurse at Harlan County General. She had the land, 40 acres of it, the south field, the creek bottom, the pine stand on the ridge, the barn that needed a new roof panel on the east side but was otherwise solid. She had enough. She was turning away from the window when she heard it. Not the wind. She knew the wind. This was different. A sound from out on Route 9, something mechanical and wrong, a high shriek of rubber on ice followed by a crash. She felt more than heard a deep percussive impact that shook the window glass faintly even at this distance. Then silence except for the wind. Ruth set down her mug. She put on her barn coat, her heavy gloves, her wool hat pulled down over her ears, and she picked up the flashlight from the hook by the back door. She did not think about whether she should go. 31 years in an emergency room teaches you not to ask that question. You go, you assess, you act with what you have. The driveway was 60 yards from the house to the road gate. Ruth walked it carefully, testing each step, the flashlight beam catching the ice crystals in the tire tracks from her truck. At the gate, she stopped, shone the light up and down Route 9. About 100 yards to the left, a motorcycle lay on its side in the ditch. The engine was still running. She could hear it laboring, see the headlight stabbing sideways up into the bare branches of a stand of locust trees. She walked toward it, keeping to the gravel shoulder, and when she got close enough, she saw the rider. He was a big man, even down on one knee in the ditch with his helmet partially off and one hand pressed to his left side. You could see the size of him. 6'3", at least 240 pounds, maybe more. Leather vest over a heavy flannel jacket. The kind of vest with patches on the back she could not read in the dark from this angle. His hands were the size of dinner plates. His face, what she could see of it under the partial helmet, was creased and weathered and set hard against whatever was happening to his body right now. He looked up when the flashlight hit him. His eyes were gray, not cold gray, pained gray. "Ma'am," he said. One word. The voice was steady despite everything, like he was trying to hold himself together through sheer stubbornness. Ruth was already crouching next to him. "Where are you hurt?" "Left side, went down on the ice. Bike hit the guard post." He paused, breathed. "Think I cracked something. Let me see." She was not asking. She put one hand on his shoulder and with the other she pressed gently along his left rib cage, watching his face. He flinched hard at the fourth and fifth ribs. She noted the location, noted the way he was breathing shallow and careful, which meant the pain was real, and he was managing it, which meant he was alert and not in shock, which was good. "Can you walk?" "Yes, ma'am." "My house is 100 yards. We're going to get you inside and look at this properly. Can you kill the engine on that bike?" He reached over and killed it. The night went quieter, just the wind and the creak of the locust branches. "The bike," he started, "will still be there in the morning. Nothing's going to move it in this cold. Come on." She got her shoulder under his right arm and he let her, which told her he was hurting worse than he was letting on, because a man that size does not accept help from a 72-year-old woman unless he has no other option. They walked up the driveway slow. He favored the left side visibly, but he walked steady. She guided him up the porch steps and through the back door into the kitchen. The warmth of the kitchen hit them both. She settled him in Harold's chair at the kitchen table, which was solid wood and had no arms to crowd him. She put water on the stove. She pulled the kitchen drawer and took out the small medical kit she kept out of habit, the same habit she'd had for 30 years because a nurse does not stop being a nurse just because she retired. Take the jacket off and the vest. He did it slowly, jaw tight. Beneath the jacket and the flannel he was wearing a thermal undershirt. She lifted it on the left side and looked. The bruising was already coming up dark purple red along the lower ribs. She palpated carefully. He was breathing controlled, watching her hands with an expression that was more curious than frightened. 2 ribs, she said. Amazing. Possibly 3. I can't do an x-ray, obviously, but the pattern and the point tenderness are consistent. They're cracked, not displaced. Nothing punctured your breath. Sounds are even. You'll hurt for 4 to 6 weeks, and you need to take it slow, but you're not going to die from this tonight. He looked at her steadily. You a doctor? Nurse. Retired. 31 years at Harlan County General. She was wrapping his ribs now, firm and even. What's your name? Cole Decker. Where were you headed, Cole? Knoxville. Club business. A pause. I know these roads. I've ridden them 100 times. Hit a patch of black ice on the curve before your gate. Didn't see it until I was already on it. Nobody sees black ice until they're on it. That's why it's called black ice. She tied off the wrap, checked her work, pressed her fingers lightly to his pulse at the wrist. Strong and even, 82 beats per minute. You got anyone you need to call family club? I'll call my road captain. Let him know where I am. He looked at her. I don't want to put you out, ma'am. If you've got a couch, The guest room has a proper bed. You're not sleeping on a couch with cracked ribs. She stood up. You want coffee or tea? He blinked, like he was recalibrating something. Coffee's fine, thank you. Cream or sugar? Black. She put the coffee on. He made the call to his road captain, short and direct, gave his location, told the man to let the chapter know he was down, but okay, would check in by morning. She could hear the voice on the other end asking questions. Cole answered them in the same clipped, steady way he had answered hers, a man accustomed to giving information without drama. She put a plate of cornbread on the table. He ate 2 pieces before she had to prompt him. She noticed he said thank you for each thing she offered without making a performance of it. She noticed the tattoo on his left forearm, a set of dates in simple block numbers. Military service dates, she recognized the format. She noticed the calluses on his hands, not just the standard working man's calluses, but the specific roughness of someone who works with engines. She noticed the patch on the back of his vest, which was hanging over the back of the chair now. Iron Saints MC, a motorcycle club. She had heard of them the way you hear of most things in a small county, vaguely and through other people's mouths. She had no particular feelings about it either way. She had seen enough of the world from behind an ER curtain to know that a man's affiliation told you less about him than his behavior in the first 5 minutes. This man's behavior in the first 5 minutes had been polite, clear, and grateful without being obsequious. That told her more than any patch. They talked a little that evening. Not much. Ruth was not a woman who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and Cole Decker clearly wasn't either. She told him Harold had been a mechanic, that he would have been interested in the motorcycle. Cole said he'd been riding 24 years, that he built his own bikes when he had time. She told him that the guest room was at the top of the stairs, that the bathroom was across the hall, that she would check on him in the morning. She stood up to clear the coffee cups. Mrs. Holden, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the full weight of those gray eyes, and there was something in the look she couldn't name right away. Not gratitude exactly, though it was that too. Something older and more complicated. My father's name was Ray Decker. He drove long haul. I-40 was his regular route. Ruth went still. 1993, Cole continued. February, he had a heart attack in his cab at mile marker 219. A woman driving past stopped. She pulled him out of the cab and did CPR on the shoulder of the road in the middle of a sleet storm. Kept him going for 11 minutes until the ambulance got there. He paused. He lived. He talked about that woman his whole life, said she had gray hair going white, and she drove a blue truck, and she didn't hesitate for 1 second. Ruth had her hand on the back of a chair. He died 8 years ago, Cole said. Natural causes in his own bed. Got to meet his grandchildren. Got to see me grow up. He looked down at the table surface. He always said he didn't know her name. Said he tried to find her and couldn't. Said if he ever met her, he would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right. Ruth sat back down. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the kitchen window. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a pipe ticked with the cold. I drove a blue truck, she said finally. Still do. Different blue truck, but still blue. Cole nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ruth looked at her hands on the table. Strong hands even now. The joints a little thicker than they used to when the veins more prominent. She thought about that February day in 1993 on I-40, the sleet coming sideways, the big truck cab, the man slumped over the wheel. She'd been driving home from a continuing education conference in Nashville. She hadn't thought about it much over the years. You stop for enough people in an emergency, and the individual moments blur together. You did what needed doing, and you moved on. She hadn't known there was a son. You were what? She said 15, 16. 16, Cole said. He called me from the hospital that night. First thing he said was, there are people in this world who don't think twice about stopping. You remember that? Ruth pulled her hands back into her lap. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily, never had been too many years of having to hold steady when everyone around her was falling apart. I'm glad he was all right, she said. I'm glad he got those years. Cole looked at her. So am I. She showed him to the guest room. She pulled out the extra quilt from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and laid it across the foot for him. She checked his pupils one more time, quick and professional, making sure there was no concussion she'd missed. His eyes tracked even and clear. She told him to wake her if the pain got worse or if he felt short of breath. He thanked her again. She turned off the light and went to her own room. She lay in bed listening to the wind and thinking about Ray Decker on the shoulder of I-40 and how his son was sleeping across the hall in the room where her own children used to sleep. She thought Harold would have found that interesting. She slept. In the morning, the storm had blown itself out. The sky was the pale, exhausted blue that comes after a hard system passes. Everything still and cold and bright, with fresh snow on every surface. Ruth made eggs and biscuits. Cole came downstairs moving carefully but steadily, the wrap holding, and he sat at the table and ate 2 full plates and drank 3 cups of coffee. He offered to pay her. She declined. He offered to pay for the room. She declined again. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he was not accustomed to having offers refused. Then let me at least help you with the bike before I call for a pickup. She agreed to that. They went out together and got the motorcycle up out of the ditch. It was damaged but not destroyed. The left foot peg bent, the mirror gone, one handlebar scuffed. Cole walked around it with the focused attention of a man examining something he loved, making an inventory of damage in his head. He said he'd have a truck come for it. He made the call. He stood in the driveway and looked at the fields and the tree line while they waited. You've got a lot of land here, he said. 40 acres. Harold's family land originally. We've been here 47 years. Good land. He looked south toward the creek bottom. That's South Field. What do you run on it? Hay mostly. I lease the cutting rights to Bobby Tanner down the road. Keep a kitchen garden up near the house. Cole nodded. There was something in the way he looked at the land, something that recognized it. Ruth had seen that look on farmers, on men who had worked soil or near it, a kind of slow assessment that had nothing to do with dollar value. The truck came. 2 younger men in Iron Saints vests, both of them polite and efficient. They loaded the bike. One of them, a lean man in his 30s named Tommy Blackwood, nodded respectfully to Ruth and called her ma'am. The other one, heavier, barely spoke. Cole stood at the truck. He turned back to Ruth one more time. Mrs. Holden. He paused and she could see him choosing words carefully. You said you were glad my father got those years. I want you to know he was a good man. He deserved them. Another pause. And if you ever need anything at all, you call. He pulled a card from his vest pocket and held it out to her. It was plain white, Iron Saints MC, a phone number, his name. Ruth took it. She held it in her hand. She was going to say something practical, something like, I'm sure I'll manage fine, or that's very kind of you. Instead, she said, I'll keep this. He nodded. He got in the truck. She watched them drive down Route 9 until the truck disappeared around the curve. She went back inside. She put the card in the kitchen drawer, under the extra batteries, in the church bulletin, in the spot where she kept things she might need and hoped she wouldn't. She did not know yet what was coming for her. She did not know yet that the 40 acres of Holden land, the Southfield and the creek bottom, and the pine stand on the ridge and Harold's oak tree were already being discussed in an office in Harlan County's only bank building by a man named Dale Briggs, who had no intention of leaving her anything at all. She would find out soon enough. Dale Briggs had been the senior loan officer at Harlan County Savings and Trust for 19 years. He was 55 years old with a broad face, a neat gray tie he wore every day, regardless of the temperature, and eyes that had the quality of still water, not calm but surface still, in a way that made it difficult to see what was moving underneath. He drove a spotless black Buick. He sat on the county zoning board. He attended First Methodist every Sunday and made a point of being seen putting his offering in the plate. He was also the kind of man who had learned early that the appearance of respectability and the reality of it were entirely separate things, and that maintaining the appearance was all that actually mattered in a small county where everyone knew everyone and nobody looked too hard. He had a spreadsheet on his computer. Not a visible one, not one you'd find on his work drive. A personal spreadsheet kept on a small device at home, tracking 5 properties in eastern Harlan County. 4 of them had already been acquired. 1 remained. The Holden Place. The interest in the Holden Place had started 2 years ago, when a geological survey contracted by a mineral extraction company out of Nashville had quietly identified a significant deposit of high-grade refractory clay beneath the eastern half of Harlan County. The deposit ran under several parcels. Most of those parcels had already been cleared through various means: foreclosures, tax sales, voluntary buyouts. The Holden Place sat on the richest vein of it. The company's representative had met with Briggs over dinner in Knoxville 6 months ago. Not officially, nothing on paper, just 2 men in a restaurant booth with steaks and whiskey talking about the kind of arrangement that moved money in ways that didn't leave obvious trails. Briggs had said he could handle it. He had handled things before. The Holden woman was a widow. Her son Jesse was a problem in a useful way. 43 years old, lived in a double-wide 12 miles away, worked irregular construction jobs, drank too much. He was the kind of man who made bad decisions when the right pressure was applied in the right direction. He'd had a small loan through the bank 2 years ago, repaid mostly, but not entirely. There was still a balance on the books, a balance Briggs controlled. The plan was not complicated. It was the kind of plan that worked because it leveraged things that already existed. Jesse Holden's financial vulnerability, the county recorder's office where Briggs had a working relationship with the deputy recorder, Sheriff Wayne Cobb, who had been in debt to Briggs in the particular way that men who accept small favors over many years eventually find themselves in debt to the men who provided them. The document Briggs needed to create was a loan agreement. The loan amount was $180,000, drawn against the Holden property as collateral. The loan would be dated 14 months ago. The loan would show Jesse Holden as co-signatory with power to encumber the property. The loan would show a series of missed payments, bringing the account into default status. The notice of default and impending foreclosure proceedings would be filed with the county court in 6 weeks. Briggs had gone over the timeline a dozen times. He was careful. He was patient. He had learned years ago that impatience was what caught men like him, the hurrying, the cutting of corners. He did not cut corners. He did not know about Cole Decker in the motorcycle and the night in the ditch on Route 9. He did not know about the card in Ruth Holden's kitchen drawer. He did not know about the 31 years of steady hands and clear thinking, or the woman who had done CPR in the sleet on I-40, or the particular kind of quiet courage that builds up in a person over 7 decades of doing hard things without being asked. He had run the numbers on Ruth Holden and concluded she was manageable. He was wrong. November became December. Ruth moved through her winter routines, the early dark, the long evenings with her medical books, and the radio, the Sunday drives to church, and May Weaver's kitchen afterward for coffee and gossip about the community. She bought firewood from Bobby Tanner's son. She made preserves from the last of her canned tomatoes. She got the truck's antifreeze checked at the Shell station on Route 12. She was not a woman who anticipated disasters. She was a woman who addressed them when they arrived. The letter arrived on a Thursday. She almost missed it. She had a larger piece of mail that day, a seed catalog she'd been waiting for, and she shuffled through the stack on the kitchen table somewhat inattentively. But the envelope from Harlan County Savings and Trust was a legal size, and it was marked important, time-sensitive in red, and even in her somewhat distracted state that caught her eye. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened it carefully the way she opened everything neatly without tearing. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it. The letter informed her that a loan in the amount of $180,000 dated 14 months ago, drawing on the Holden property at Route 9, Harlan County, Tennessee, was currently in default status with total arrears of $22,400. Pursuant to the terms of the loan agreement, Harlan County Savings and Trust was initiating foreclosure proceedings. She had 30 days to cure the default or surrender the property. Enclosed was a copy of the loan document. Jesse's name was on it, and at the bottom on the co-signatory line for the property owner was a signature that was supposed to be hers. Ruth looked at that signature for a long time. She had been signing her name the same way since she was 12 years old. She knew exactly what her signature looked like. The backward lean of the capital R, the particular loop she made in the H of Holden, a habit from a handwriting teacher in elementary school who had praised that loop once and made it permanent in her muscle memory. The signature on the document was close. It was a competent forgery. Someone had studied her handwriting, but it was not hers. Ruth sat at her kitchen table with the afternoon light going flat and cold outside the window, and she felt the peculiar calm that comes when something terrible becomes undeniable. She had felt it before, at Harold's bedside, at her mother's, in the ER when a situation moved past the point of uncertainty into the point of known crisis, and the only remaining question was how to respond. She was not going to cry about this. She was going to respond to it. She called Robert Tillis first, the only lawyer in Harlan County she'd had any dealings with, a small and conscientious man who had handled Harold's estate. She reached his secretary. She explained what she had. The secretary put her on hold for 4 minutes and then told her Mr. Tillis was unavailable but could call her back. He did not call back that day. She called the next morning. The secretary's voice was different this time, careful in a way that had not been there before. Mr. Tillis was sorry, but he had a conflict with this matter and was unable to represent her. He wished her well in resolving it. Ruth thanked her and hung up. She sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone. A conflict. In a county this size, a conflict meant someone had already gotten to Robert Tillis. It meant someone knew she would call him first. It meant this was not a random administrative error. This was planned, and the planning had been thorough. She called the only other lawyer that she could think of, a man named Garrett in Pineville, who handled property disputes. She explained her situation. He listened, and she could hear the quality of his listening change partway through, a slight drawing back, a cooling. He told her he would need to look into it and would call her. He did not call. She drove to Pineville herself the following week. His secretary told her Mr. Garrett was very sorry, but he was also unable to take the case at this time. Ruth drove home on Route 9. She passed the spot where the ditch was, where the locust trees stood bare and black against the winter sky. She thought about the card in her kitchen drawer. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. Independence was not a posture with her, it was a genuine preference, a deep-rooted preference built from decades of managing things herself, because that was what was required. Harold had been a good partner, and she had missed him every day for 4 years. But she had never been the kind of woman who could not function without a partner. She functioned. She always functioned. And she was not afraid of Dale Briggs or whoever was behind him. But she was a practical woman. A practical woman looked at what she had and what she needed, and she made the best use of both. What she had was a card with a phone number on it. What she needed was someone who would not be scared off. May Weaver came over that evening the way she did several times a week, letting herself in the back door, with the ease of 50 years of neighborly friendship, bringing a pot of soup because May always brought food when she came in winter. Ruth sat her down at the kitchen table and showed her the letter. May read it. She read it a second time. Her face went through several things. "This isn't real," May said. "You didn't take out a loan." "No, I didn't. That's your signature." "It's a forgery, a good one, but a forgery." May set the letter down. She was 70 years old, a small woman with white hair and the sharp, alert eyes of someone who had paid close attention to things her whole life. She had worked the county clerk's office for 22 years before she retired. She understood how county documents worked. You know who's behind this, May said. It was not a question. I have a suspicion. Dale Briggs has had his eye on this land for 2 years, since that geological survey. May said it matter-of-factly, the way you say things you've known for a while. Bobby Tanner's boy told me in October that someone from a Nashville company had been out walking the South Field with survey equipment. Bobby saw them from his tractor. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to worry you over something that might be nothing. May looked at the letter again. It's not nothing. No, Ruth said. It's not. May looked at her. What are you going to do? Ruth thought about Cole Decker sitting at this table eating cornbread, saying my father talked about that woman his whole life. She thought about the 34 years between that February day on I-40 and this November in Harlan County, and how sometimes the world arranged itself in ways that made a kind of sense you couldn't see while you were living through it. I'm going to make a phone call, she said. May watched her go to the drawer, watched her come back with the plain white card. Who is that? Ruth looked at the card. Iron Saints MC Cole Decker. Someone who owes me a favor, she said, and I believe he'll want to pay it. She picked up the phone. Outside, the wind came up again, moving through Harold's oak tree, rustling what few dead leaves still clung to the high branches. The kitchen was warm. The lamp on the table made a yellow circle of light. Ruth Holden dialed the number. It rang twice. Decker, said the voice on the other end. Clipped, alert, ready. Mr. Decker, Ruth said. This is Ruth Holden, Route 9, Harlan County. You slept in my guest room 3 weeks ago. A brief pause. Mrs. Holden. And in the way he said her name, she heard it, the recognition, the shift in register, something warming slightly under the control. Is everything all right? No, she said. It is not. And I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't have anyone else to call, and I think you meant what you said about being available if I needed something. I meant every word of it. No hesitation. Tell me. So Ruth Holden sat down at her kitchen table with May Weaver across from her and the letter from Harlan County Savings and Trust on the surface between them, and she told Cole Decker what was happening to her land. She told it clearly and in order, the way she had always presented patient information. No dramatics, no unnecessary detail, just the facts in the sequence that mattered. The letter, the forged signature, the lawyers who wouldn't take the case, the geological survey, the name Dale Briggs. Cole listened without interrupting. When she was done, there was a brief silence on the line. Not the silence of a man deciding whether to get involved. The silence of a man deciding how. Mrs. Holden, he said, you still have that card? I'm holding it in my hand. Save it. I'll be there in 2 days. I'm bringing Tommy Blackwood and a few others. We're going to need to look at those documents. A pause. Don't speak to anyone from that bank. Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone onto that property without your consent. You understand? I've been managing my own affairs for 47 years, Mr. Decker. She heard something in the line then. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. Yes, ma'am, he said. I believe you have. She hung up. May was watching her from across the table. Well, May said. Ruth folded her hands on the table. She looked out the window at the dark beyond the glass at Harold's oak tree, invisible now in the night. They'll be here Thursday, she said. May absorbed this. Bikers, she said. You're calling in bikers. I'm calling in people who won't be scared off, Ruth said. There's a difference. May looked at the letter on the table. She looked at Ruth. Harold would have said you were something else, May said. Ruth almost smiled. Harold would have made coffee and gotten out of the way. That is exactly what he would have done, May agreed. And there in the warm kitchen with the wind outside and the letter on the table and 40 acres of Holden land waiting in the dark, Ruth Holden let herself feel for exactly 1 moment what she actually felt, which was afraid and alone and furious at the audacity of a man who thought a 72-year-old widow was something he could just take from. 1 moment. That was enough. Then she got up, put the kettle on, and started thinking about what she needed to have ready for Thursday. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was frightened, or not only because of that. She was a woman who processed things in sleep, who had always done her best thinking in the space between waking and under that deep place where the mind sorted through what the day had given it, without the interference of logic getting in the way too soon. That night her mind would not settle. It kept returning to the letter, to the signature, to the particular shape of the R in Ruth that she had carried in her hand since childhood. and that someone had studied closely enough to replicate. That was what bothered her most, the intimacy of it. To forge a signature, you had to look at it for a long time. You had to practice. You had to sit somewhere with a pen and a sheet of paper and work at it the way a student works at learning something deliberately with attention. Whoever had done this had gotten a copy of her actual signature from somewhere, a bank document, a tax filing, a county record. There were ways, she knew there were ways, but knowing there were ways and knowing that someone had actually done it, had actually studied the particular curve of her handwriting, the way you might study a photograph of someone you were planning to impersonate, that sat in her stomach differently than the abstract fact of fraud. It meant she had been watched, studied, targeted. It meant someone had decided at some specific point in time that Ruth Holden was a problem to be solved. She got up at 4:30, which was not unusual for her. The dark hours of winter mornings had always been hers. Harold had been a late sleeper by nature, and she had always used those early hours for the things that required quiet. Reading, thinking, the particular kind of internal housekeeping that does not get done in the loud parts of the day. She put on coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. She wrote down everything she knew, the letter and its date, the loan amount $180,000, the terms of default as stated, the 30-day cure period, the names of the two lawyers who had declined to see her, the geological survey that Bobby Tanner's son had witnessed in the South Field, Dale Briggs's name and position. Then she wrote down what she did not know, who specifically had forged the signature and how they had accessed her handwriting samples, whether Jesse had been coerced or willing, how far the county recorder's involvement went, whether Sheriff Cobb knew or whether he was simply a man who would be useful to the people who did know. She wrote, "What is the clay worth?" That question she circled, because everything else followed from that. A man like Dale Briggs did not take risks for small returns. He was a man who calculated. If he had gone to the trouble of constructing this, of building a false loan document and getting it into the county records and pressuring two lawyers to decline her case, then what was underneath that Southfield had to be worth considerably more than the property itself. She thought about that Southfield. She had walked it every season for 47 years. She knew which corners held water after a hard rain and which drained fast. She knew where the soil changed color from the brown-red clay at the surface to a deeper, darker seam that ran diagonally from the creek bottom up toward the ridge. Harold had sometimes commented on it, said the subsoil down there was different from the North Field. Dense, smooth, not good for crops, but interesting. She had not thought about it as anything other than soil. She wrote, "Find out who the Nashville company is. Find out what refractory clay is worth per ton." She was still writing when the sky outside began to lighten. By the time she heard the birds start up in Harold's oak tree, she had 2 full pages. She was not a woman who sat still in the face of a problem. She drove into town that morning. She went to the county recorder's office first. It was a small office in the annex of the courthouse, staffed by a deputy recorder named Patricia Loomis and a part-time assistant. Ruth had known Patricia for 20 years, in the way, people in a small county, not intimately but steadily through accumulated encounters at church suppers and school functions and the counter of the post office. Patricia was behind her desk when Ruth came in. She looked up with the standard county employee pleasantness, and then her expression flickered. Just slightly, just enough for a woman who paid attention to notice. She knew. Ruth kept her own face neutral. She asked to see the recorded document on the Holden property loan. Patricia said it was a matter of public record and she could provide a copy. She went to retrieve it and was gone slightly longer than that retrieval should have required. Ruth used the time to look around the office at the filing cabinets along the wall, at the computer on the part-time assistant's desk, at the door to the back room that was slightly ajar. Patricia came back with the copy. Ruth thanked her. She looked at the document in the car before she drove anywhere. It was recorded correctly in the formal sense. The notary seal was present. The filing date was within the stated timeline. Whoever had done this had done it properly through the official channels, which meant someone in or with access to this office had allowed a fraudulent document to move through the recording process without flagging it. Patricia Loomis, or someone Patricia had accommodated. Ruth drove to the library. The Harlan County Public Library was a modest building on Courthouse Square, staffed by a librarian named Dolores, who had been there since the 1980s and who regarded the internet as both a miracle and a threat. Ruth asked for computer time. Dolores set her up at one of the three public terminals. Ruth spent an hour and 40 minutes online. By the time she was done, she had found the Nashville company, Meridian Mineral Resources, LLC, incorporated 4 years ago. Principal offices in a Nashville business park listed principals, including two names she had never heard of and one she had. A man named Frank Hensley, who was also listed on the board of directors of a real estate holding company called Blue Ridge Acquisitions, which had purchased two properties in eastern Harlan County in the past 18 months. One of them was the Alderman farm. Ruth knew the Aldermans. They had sold their place suddenly quickly and had moved to Cookville without much explanation. She had thought it was a family decision. It had not been a family decision. She sat back in the library chair. She thought about the other properties, the Aldermans. Who else? She searched county property records for the past 2 years. She found 3 other parcels that had transferred ownership in the past 24 months under circumstances that shared a pattern. 2 foreclosures, 1 voluntary sale at significantly below market value by a family that had apparently been under some kind of financial pressure. All 3 properties were in the eastern quarter. All 3 would fall within the range of a significant clay deposit if the deposit was as large as a serious extraction operation would require. The hold-in place was the last piece. She printed what she could, folded the papers into her coat pocket, thanked Dolores, and drove home. She sat at the kitchen table with her legal pad and her printed documents, and she understood the scope of what she was dealing with. This was not Dale Briggs acting on his own initiative for personal gain, though personal gain was certainly part of it. This was a piece of a larger operation, one with enough capital behind it to corrupt county officials, to buy lawyers' silence to construct fraudulent documents that passed through official channels. The money behind Meridian Mineral Resources was real money, the kind of money that hired people to make problems go away quietly. She was the problem. She was a 72-year-old widow who grew hay on 40 acres and kept a kitchen garden and went to church on Sundays. She was also a woman who had kept people alive through 31 years of emergencies by refusing to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was in front of her. You assessed. You used what you had. You did not look at the whole disaster at once, but at the immediate next step and then the one after that. The immediate next step was Thursday when Cole Decker arrived. She organized her documents. She made a second copy of everything and drove it to May's house because May's house was a place that Dale Briggs would have no reason to look, and because if something happened to Ruth's copies, May would have the second set. May took the envelope without drama, put it in her kitchen drawer, and made Ruth eat a bowl of soup before she let her leave. On Wednesday evening, the phone rang. She answered it on the second ring. The voice was male, middle-aged, carefully pleasant. He introduced himself as a representative of Harlan County Savings and Trust calling to her to discuss her account matter. He said he understood she might have concerns about the letter she'd received. He said there were often these kinds of misunderstandings, and he was sure they could be resolved in a way that worked for everyone. He said if she was interested in discussing a modified payment arrangement or a voluntary sale of the property to simplify matters, the bank was prepared to be very accommodating. Ruth listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "I don't believe we have anything to discuss. I did not take out this loan and I did not sign any document authorizing one. The signature on that document is a forgery and the loan itself is fraudulent. If anyone contacts me again about this matter outside of formal legal proceedings, I will be filing a complaint with the Tennessee Department of Financial Institutions in the State Attorney General's office." A brief silence. "Mrs. Holden," the man said, and the pleasantness had thinned slightly. "I understand you're upset, but I'd encourage you to think carefully before—" "I have thought carefully," Ruth said. I have been thinking carefully since the moment that letter arrived. Thank you for your call. Do not call again." She hung up. Her hands were steady. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then she got up and made supper. She ate at the kitchen table with the radio on the same country station Harold had always kept it on. She washed the dishes. She folded a load of laundry. She did her evening routines with the deliberate orderliness she always brought to them, because the routines were what held the shape of a day, and losing the shape of days was how people came undone. She was not going to come undone. Thursday morning, she was up at 4:30 again, coffee made, and a full breakfast of eggs and biscuits and bacon by 8 because she expected that Cole Decker was the kind of man who came on time, and she intended to be ready. She had the documents laid out on the kitchen table. She had her legal pad. She had the printed library research. She heard the engines at 8:45. Not one engine, several. She went to the front window and looked out at Route 9. There were 6 motorcycles turning into her driveway. Cole Decker in front, Tommy Blackwood behind him, 4 others she didn't know, all in Iron Saints vests, all large men who moved with the particular economy of people who spent time on bikes and did not waste motion. They parked in the gravel beside the house in a loose line and came to the door in ones and twos. Cole knocked. She opened the door. He was the same as she remembered the size of him, the gray eyes, the steady way he held himself. He had 2 men with him at the door, Tommy Blackwood and a broader man he introduced as Frank Riggs, who turned out to have spent 12 years as a paralegal before he patched into the Iron Saints, which explained the careful way he shook her hand and looked at the documents on the table. "Mrs. Holden," Cole said, "thank you for trusting us with this." "Thank you for coming," she said. "Coffee is on, and there's breakfast if anyone is hungry. Come in." They came in, all 6 of them in her kitchen, which was not a small kitchen, but which became considerably more occupied than she was accustomed to. They were careful with her things, careful with their voices, careful in the way that large men sometimes are, in spaces that belong to older women. A particular kind of consideration she noticed and appreciated without making a point of it. Cole and Frank Riggs sat at the table with the documents. Tommy Blackwood sat to the side listening. The other 3 men took coffee and stood near the windows or leaned against the counter out of the way but present. Frank Riggs put on reading glasses. He went through the loan document, page by page, slowly making notes. He went through the county recorder's copy. He looked at the notary seal. He set his pen down. "This notary seal," he said. "Do you recognize this notary?" "Patricia Loomis," Ruth said, "Deputy County Recorder." Frank nodded, made a note. "The document is otherwise plausible on its face. The language is standard. The filing process appears to have followed normal procedure." He looked up at her. "You're certain about the signature?" "I'm absolutely certain." "I believe you," he said simply, and went back to his notes. Cole was looking at the research she'd printed from the library. His jaw was set. He read the Meridian Mineral Resources information twice. "You put this together yourself," he said. "Yesterday at the library," Ruth said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. "They've been at this for 2 years," he said. "Minimum. This isn't impulse. This is a deliberate acquisition campaign." "That was my assessment as well," Ruth said. Cole looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him. Something passed between them, the kind of wordless communication between people who have known each other a long time. "We need to know about Jesse," Cole said. He said it carefully with the tone of a man who understood he was asking about something personal. Ruth folded her hands on the table. "Jesse is my son," she said. "He is 43 years old. He has struggled with alcohol for most of his adult life. He is not a bad man. He is a man who has made a lot of bad decisions because he never learned how to say no to the wrong people." She paused. "If his name is on that document, it is because someone made him an offer that seemed manageable to him at the time, or because someone frightened him, or both. I do not know yet which." Cole nodded slowly. "Has he contacted you?" "Not since the letter arrived. He knows something is wrong. He always goes quiet when something is wrong. We'll need to talk to him." "I know," Ruth said. "I'll make the call." She stood up to refill the coffee. At the window over the sink, she could see Harold's oak tree, the bare branches making their gray lattice against the winter sky. 47 years of winters, 40 acres of Holden land. She filled the cups. She came back to the table. She sat down across from Cole Decker, the man whose father she had kept alive on a highway shoulder 33 years ago, and she looked at the documents between them, the fraudulent loan and the forged signature, and the evidence of a 2-year campaign to take everything she had left. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we do first." Cole started with the simplest question first, which was the one that would tell him the most. "Who does Jesse trust?" he asked. Ruth thought about it. "He trusts only Tommy Roth, who he went to high school with. Tommy runs the bait shop on Route 12. He trusts Pastor Aldrich at Second Baptist. And," she paused, "he trusts me when he's sober enough to trust anyone." "Then that's where we start." Cole looked at Tommy Blackwood. "You want to take a ride out to Route 12. Tommy nodded. He drank off the last of his coffee and set the cup in the sink and put his jacket back on with the ease of a man who was used to being in motion, who treated any given location as temporary until the work was done. He gave Ruth a small nod on his way out, the kind of respectful acknowledgement she had come to recognize from these men, and then he was gone, the sound of his motorcycle starting up and fading down Route 9. Frank Riggs spent the next 2 hours at Ruth's kitchen table with the documents and a yellow legal pad, building a timeline. He was methodical and quiet, asking her questions at intervals, precise questions about dates and names and events, and when she answered, he wrote it down without editorial comment. She appreciated that. She had given and received information in emergencies for 31 years, and she knew the difference between someone who was listening carefully and someone who was performing attention. Frank was listening. By the time he was done, he had a timeline that went back 26 months. The first piece was the geological survey. The second was the formation of Meridian Mineral Resources, LLC. The third was the Blue Ridge Acquisitions purchase of the Alderman Farm. Then 2 more property transactions, both under pressure, both concluded quickly and at below market prices. And running parallel to all of it, a series of small interactions between Dale Briggs and various county entities, the zoning board, the recorder's office, the sheriff's department, that on their own seemed routine but in context formed a pattern. He's been building this for over 2 years, Frank said. This level of coordination requires either significant money or significant leverage over the people involved, and probably both. Sheriff Cobb, Ruth said. Frank glanced at Cole. Cole set his coffee cup down. Tell me about Cobb. Wayne Cobb has been sheriff of this county for 11 years. He came up through the department. He is not a stupid man, but he is an accommodating one. He has a good political instinct for aligning himself with whoever holds real power in a community. Ruth was straightforward about it. She had watched Wayne Cobb for 11 years. He will not act against Dale Briggs unless the risk of not acting is greater than the risk of acting. We need to make the risk of not acting very large, Cole said. Yes, Ruth agreed. We do. Cole stood and looked out the back window at the south field. The morning had brightened thin winter sun on the snow, and from this angle you could see the full length of the field, the fence line, the creek trees in the distance. How many people in this county know about the survey, the clay? I don't know who else Briggs has told, presumably the people he needed to tell to make this work. Cobb Patricia Loomis, whoever prepared the fraudulent document, he'll have kept it as tight as possible. Because if it gets out, the whole county has skin in this. Not just you. Ruth had thought about this. The mineral rights on most of these properties will have been retained by the landowners when they sold. If Meridian starts extracting and the remaining landowners realize they were effectively excluded from a discovery that was on their land, there will be a legal problem larger than I am. Cole turned from the window. Who else in this county has property in the Eastern Corridor? At least a dozen families, the Tanners, the Weavers, the Brixton family on the ridge. Ruth considered. May Weaver's land runs alongside mine to the north. Bobby Tanner's field is adjacent to the south. Bobby Tanner, the man who leases your hayfield. His son saw the survey crew. Bobby is the kind of man who would want to know what that survey found. Cole looked at her steadily. Mrs. Holden, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about whether you're comfortable with it. What I'm thinking about doing is broader than just your situation. If we're going to stop this effectively, we need to make noise, not violent noise, legal noise, community noise. The kind that is harder to suppress than one person fighting one fraudulent loan. That means bringing other people in. It means this stops being a private matter. Ruth looked at him. She looked at the documents on the table. She thought about the letter with the forged signature and the man who had spent 2 years building a plan to take her land and the 2 lawyers who had been too afraid to help her. I have spent my career showing up for other people, she said. If this is happening to me, it happened to the aldermans first, and it will happen to the next family after me if someone doesn't stop it. I am not interested in a solution that only protects my 40 acres. She paused. Make whatever noise needs to be made. Cole nodded once, like that was what he expected, but he'd needed to hear her say it. The second problem arrived that afternoon in the form of a visit from Sheriff Wayne Cobb. Ruth saw the cruiser come up the driveway from the kitchen window. She watched it park. She watched Cobb get out, a heavy-set man in a brown uniform with a careful walk that suggested a man who had thought about this visit in advance and decided how he wanted it to appear. He was alone. That was interesting. She opened the back door before he knocked. Wayne, she said. Ruth. Cobb looked past her into the kitchen, where Cole and Frank were still at the table, and two of the other Iron Saints men were visible. His expression managed to stay neutral, which told her he was expecting them to be there. Someone had told him about Thursday's meeting. Can we talk privately? You can say whatever you have to say in front of my guests. A small adjustment in his posture. Ruth, I'm here as a courtesy. The bank has the right to pursue this debt through legal channels. That's all this is. The debt is fraudulent, Ruth said. I did not sign that document. Now there may be some confusion about the signature, but the loan itself, there is no confusion, Wayne. I have signed my name the same way for 60 years. That is not my signature. Cobb shifted his weight. He looked at Cole, then at Frank, then back at Ruth. I've also been getting calls from people outside this county. He said it carefully, like he was letting her understand something without stating it plainly. People expressing concern about outsider involvement in a local financial matter. Cole spoke from the table. What kind of people, Sheriff? Cobb looked at him. And you are Cole Decker, Iron Saints, MC. Mrs. Holden is a friend of our club. The word club landed in the kitchen with a particular weight. Cobb was not a man who had dealings with motorcycle clubs, but he was a man who understood what it meant to have organizational backing in a dispute. Ruth watched him process this information. I'm not looking for trouble, Cobb said. I'm asking for this to be handled through appropriate channels. So are we, Cole said. He was at the table, his hands flat and still on the surface, his voice completely level. Mrs. Holden is going to file a fraud complaint with the Tennessee Department of Financial Institutions. She's going to file a complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. She's going to present evidence of a forged document and coordinated pressure on local legal counsel. If appropriate channels work the way they're supposed to, that will resolve things properly. If they don't, he paused. There are other channels. Cobb looked at him for a long moment. Nobody's doing anything inappropriate here, Cobb said, and the phrasing of it was revealing nobody's doing anything inappropriate. Not nobody did anything wrong. Not there's no fraud here. Just a flattened, careful assertion about the present moment. Ruth noticed it. She suspected Cole noticed it too. Then we won't have any problems, Ruth said. Thank you for stopping by, Wayne. Cobb looked at her one more time. He had the expression of a man who was doing a kind of moral arithmetic, weighing what he had been promised against what was actually in front of him. He turned and walked back to his cruiser. Ruth watched the cruiser back out and turned down Route 9. She closed the door. He knows, she said. He knows, Cole agreed. The question is whether he decides to ride it out or find a way to get clear before it comes apart. Do you think it will come apart? Cole looked at her steadily. Yes, but it's going to get worse before it does. He was right. It got worse the next morning. Jesse Holden showed up at Ruth's door at 9 o'clock, and the state of him told her everything before he said a word. He was pale and had not slept, and he smelled of the previous night's drinking even through the cold air. He was wearing his old canvas work jacket with the broken zipper, and his eyes had the look she had seen on him since he was a teenager, the look of a man who was ashamed but not yet sure how much or of what. She let him in. She did not say anything beyond his name. She put coffee on. She sat across from him at the table and she waited. He talked at the coffee cup for a while without looking at her. He talked about the loan, about how a man had come to see him 9 months ago, a man from the bank, and how the man had explained that there was a loan taken against the property and that Jesse was on the loan documents and that this was actually a good thing, an opportunity for Jesse to get right financially if he would cooperate with the bank's management of it. What did cooperating mean, Ruth said. Jesse wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He said sign a couple of papers confirming the loan details. Said it would protect my interest in the property. Said if Mama, he stopped, if you ever had to sell, I'd have a legal claim to a share of the proceeds. And you believe that? Jesse finally looked up. His eyes were red. He showed me the papers, with your name on them. I thought you'd done it without telling me. Made some arrangement. It seemed like something you might do without telling me because... He stopped again. Because you knew I'd drink any money up, Ruth thought. Because you've been protecting me from my own worst nature so long, you know I can't be trusted with information about assets. She did not say any of it. She had said some version of it to Jesse many times over many years, and she knew the effect it had, which was to close him down rather than open him up. You signed the papers they showed you, she said. I signed papers I thought were confirming something that already existed. I didn't know. He stopped. His jaw was working. I got a call last week. Different man. Told me the loan was in default and that if I didn't cooperate with the bank's recovery of the property, they'd file criminal charges against me for my role in the loan arrangement. Ruth was very still. Criminal charges for what? She said carefully. Conspiracy. Defrauding the bank. I don't know exactly. The man used a lot of words that I couldn't follow all of it. Jesse looked at his hands. He said if I made any noise, if I talked to you or to lawyers or to anyone, they had documentation that would look like I was in on it from the start, like I was the one who forged your name. And there it was. The trap inside the trap. They had used Jesse to create the appearance of family involvement, and now they were using the same involvement as a threat to keep him quiet and keep Ruth isolated. It was a clean piece of work, she thought, in the cold, clear way you could think that about even a thing done against you if you were honest about what you were looking at. She reached across the table and put her hand over Jesse's. He looked up at her, startled. She rarely touched him. She loved him, had always loved him, with the complicated and non-sentimental love of a mother who has watched a child make the same mistake in different forms across 4 decades. She had stopped showing it in physical ways because he had stopped being able to receive it in those ways, too loaded with his own shame. Right now, he was still enough to receive it. Jesse, she said, do you want to help me fix this? He stared at her. They set you up, she said. You signed papers that were presented to you dishonestly. You were given false information about what you were signing. That is not the same as committing fraud. It is being the victim of fraud. She held his eyes. But what you do next matters. If you tell the truth about what happened clearly and completely to the right people, that helps us. It helps me, and it helps you. Jesse was quiet for a long time. They said they had documentation, he said. They have fabricated documentation. That's different. A man who fabricates documents and then uses them to threaten witnesses is committing a serious federal crime, Jesse. They are more afraid of being exposed than you are. She paused. Will you talk to someone, a man named Frank Riggs? He used to work in law. He's here in my house right now. Jesse looked toward the interior of the house. There are bikers in your house, he said. There are people helping me in my house. Yes, they ride motorcycles. Jesse was quiet again. She watched him doing it, the arithmetic of a man weighing the fear of one thing against the fear of another. Okay, he said finally. Okay, Mama. Frank Riggs talked to Jesse for 3 hours. Ruth stayed out of it, busying herself with the tasks of the house, the laundry, the dishes, the firewood she stacked on the porch. She could hear the murmur of voices from the kitchen, but not the words. At one point, she heard Jesse's voice rise briefly, and then Frank's steady and low, and then Jesse's voice come back down. When they came out of the kitchen, Jesse looked wrung out but cleaner somehow, like something that had been carried at pressure had been set down. Frank caught Ruth's name and gave her a small nod. That evening, after Jesse had gone home with a promise to return tomorrow and a written account of everything he remembered about the papers he'd signed, Cole gathered the Iron Saints men in Ruth's living room. She sat in the armchair by the fire. May had driven over and sat on the sofa. It was, she thought, the most unusual meeting that living room had ever hosted. Cole stood by the fireplace. He laid out what they had. They had the fraudulent loan document and Ruth's categorical denial of her signature. They had Jesse's account of how he'd been manipulated. They had the timeline of property acquisitions and the connection to Meridian Mineral Resources. They had Cobb's visit, which was not evidence of anything on its own, but which had the flavor of a man trying to contain rather than investigate. What they did not have yet was the crucial piece, a clear paper connection between Briggs and the fraudulent documents creation. Frank had examined the notary seal and believed there was an irregularity in the stamp impression that a forensic document examiner could work with. But they needed a forensic document examiner, and they needed one outside the county. They also needed a lawyer. I have a contact in Knoxville, Frank said. An attorney named Gregory Weaver. Not related, he added with a glance at May, who smiled briefly. He handles financial fraud cases. He's worked with law enforcement before, but he's not afraid of cases that make county officials uncomfortable. I'll call him tomorrow. What about the 30-day window? Ruth said. The cure period in the letter. We'll file an emergency motion to stay the foreclosure proceedings while the fraud investigation is pending. That buys us time. Not unlimited time, but time. Frank looked at her steadily. Mrs. Holden, I want to be honest with you. Even with all of this is going to be a fight. A real one. These people have resources and connections, and they've had 2 years to set this up. We have been at it for 4 days. I've nursed patients who came in 4 days into a crisis, Ruth said. It's 4 days of deterioration you have to work back from. But the working back is what matters. Frank looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, the dry appreciation of a careful person recognizing another. Yes, ma'am, he said. Tommy Blackwood had spent the day at the bait shop on Route 12 with Tommy Roth, who turned out to be exactly the kind of man Ruth had described. He'd known Jesse since they were boys. He'd watched the whole situation with the bank letters with growing alarm and had twice tried to call Jesse and been told by Jesse's girlfriend that Jesse wasn't available. What Tommy Roth had also done on his own initiative was start talking to other people in the county whose land lay in the Eastern Corridor. He had talked to Bobby Tanner. Bobby Tanner had been angry for 6 months. His son had witnessed the survey crew in Ruth's South Field, and Bobby had been trying ever since to find out who had commissioned it, because if there was something valuable under that clay and his land ran alongside the South Field, then it was under his land too. He had hit the same walls Ruth had with lawyers. He had thought he was the only one running into walls. He was not the only one. Tommy brought Bobby Tanner to Ruth's house on Saturday morning. Bobby was a rangy man in his 50s with a weathered face and the particular directness of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and had no patience for indirection. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table and listened to everything. Then he said, I know 2 other families on the ridge who have the same kind of land, who are going to have the same problem eventually if Briggs gets what he wants here. He looked at Ruth. You want them at a meeting? I think, Ruth said, that would be useful. The meeting was Sunday afternoon after church. Ruth's living room held 12 people, the Iron Saints men, arrayed along the walls. The county families sitting wherever they could fit, some of them knowing each other well, and some of them knowing each other only by road. Bobby Tanner, May Weaver, a woman named Clara Brixton from the Ridge Farm, 68 years old and iron-spined, who had farmed her family's land alone since her husband passed. A man named Roy Pierce, who had the creek bottom place to the south. 3 others. Cole let Frank run the meeting, which was the right instinct. Frank laid out the information the way he'd laid it out for Ruth without drama and sequence. When he was done, the room was quiet for a moment. Clara Brixton spoke first. I received a letter 3 months ago, she said, from a man at the bank, asking if I was interested in a voluntary sale. I told him I was not. He called twice more. I stopped answering. She looked at Ruth. I didn't know it was connected to what's happening to you. Roy Pierce had a similar story, a buyer's inquiry letter from Blue Ridge Acquisitions 18 months ago. An offer that was polite but below market. He'd declined. He'd thought it was routine. He had not connected it to anything. The room began to understand what they were looking at. Cole spoke once toward the end. He said they were going to fight this through legal channels and that Frank was already in contact with an attorney in Knoxville. He said the Iron Saints would provide whatever support the community needed in terms of documentation, logistics, and presence. He said the most important thing is that no one do anything rash because the people behind this were counting on someone doing something that could be used against them. Stay legal, he said. Stay coordinated. Don't let anyone divide you. He looked around the room. They took 5 properties already because those families fought alone. You're not fighting alone. On Monday, Frank Riggs drove to Knoxville and sat down with Gregory Weaver, the attorney. He was back by evening. He came into Ruth's kitchen and sat down and told her Weaver had agreed to take the case. More than that, Weaver had told Frank that he had been watching Meridian Mineral Resources for 8 months in the context of an unrelated matter, and that he had contacts at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation who had an open inquiry into certain county-level financial irregularities in eastern Tennessee. The Holden case was not the start of something. It was the end of something that had already been accumulating for a while. Frank put down his pen. There's more, he said. Ruth looked at him. Weaver's TBI contact told him there's already a federal angle. The mineral extraction company that's backing Meridian has investors that cross state lines. The FBI field office in Knoxville has been looking at this from the federal side. Frank paused. There is a reason the lawyers in this county were scared to help you. This isn't Dale Briggs working a local scheme. This is a thread in something significantly larger. Ruth sat with that. Outside the kitchen window, Harold's oak tree stood in the late afternoon light, bare and tall, and still rooted to the 40-acre parcel that 3 generations of Holdens had worked and maintained and passed down. How long, she said, before anything is done? The TBI and FBI move at their own pace, but Weaver says our fraud case can go forward independently. We file the emergency stay on the foreclosure. We file the fraud complaint. We make this public and documented. The federal investigation adds pressure from above. Frank looked at her. But there is a risk in this, and I need you to understand it. Tell me, when we file and go public, Briggs will know the containment has failed. He may accelerate. He may try to do something to resolve this in his favor before the legal process catches up. He has used pressure before. We don't know exactly what form that pressure takes when it escalates. The room was very quiet. From the living room, she could hear low voices, a couple of the Iron Saints men talking, the sound of boots on her hardwood floor, the sound of people who were present and intended to stay present. Ruth thought about escalation. She thought about what it meant in practical terms for a 72-year-old woman living alone at the end of a county road. She was not a naive person. She had worked in an emergency room for 31 years, and she understood that people who had committed significant crimes and were facing exposure were not predictable in the ways that stable people were predictable. She also understood that fear of this was the entire mechanism by which a man like Briggs operated. Remove the isolation, remove the fear, and what you had left was simply a criminal who needed to be caught. She was not isolated anymore. I understand the risk, she said. Cole has already arranged for 2 men to be on the property around the clock, Frank said. You won't see them, but they'll be there. If anything changes, you call this number. He slid a card across the table, Cole's number again, but also Tommy Blackwood's. Ruth looked at the card. She thought about a different card in a different kitchen 40 years, and more ago a card from an ambulance crew who had thanked her for what she did on I-40 and told her if she ever needed anything, she should call. She had never called. She had managed, always managed. She had thought of self-sufficiency as a virtue so fundamental that asking for help felt like a kind of failure. She was learning at 72 in the winter of the hardest season she could remember that she had been wrong about that what she had called self-sufficiency was sometimes just pride wearing a practical coat, that the people you helped, if you helped them honestly and without accounting, had a different relationship to debt than the kind of debt that got recorded in ledgers. That there were things you built up in the world through decades of showing up, through keeping people alive who needed keeping alive, through stopping on a sleet-covered highway when everyone else drove past, and that what you built up had weight in reality, even if you had never thought of it as a resource. She was not alone. She put the card in her pocket. All right, she said, what do we do next? And that was the moment that everything began to move in a different direction. Though Ruth Holden did not know yet how far or how fast that movement would go, or what it would ask of her before it was done, she only knew that she had her documents and her lawyer and her neighbors and 6 men in Iron Saints vests who were not leaving, and that the man who had planned to take 40 acres of Holden land from a widow who he thought was manageable had made an error in calculation that was going to become very clear to him very soon. She only knew that she had stopped being afraid of him, and the not being afraid of him felt like her own ground underneath her feet. The filing went in on Tuesday morning, Gregory Weaver's name at the top, submitted to the Harlan County Circuit Court and simultaneously to the Tennessee Department of Financial Institutions in Nashville. By Tuesday afternoon, the emergency stay on foreclosure proceedings had been granted a temporary measure pending a hearing scheduled for 3 weeks out. Weaver had also filed the formal fraud complaint, naming the loan document as a forgery, naming Dale Briggs as the responsible party at the bank, and naming Sheriff Cobb as a person of interest in the suppression of the victim's legal options. The complaint went to the State Attorney General's office, and through a contact Weaver had cultivated over 15 years of financial fraud litigation directly to a desk at the TBE field office in Nashville. By Wednesday morning, Dale Briggs knew. Ruth knew he knew because Patricia Loomis, the deputy county recorder, called her at 7 o'clock in the morning and asked if they could speak. Ruth said yes. Patricia came over at 9, driving her own car, a small sedan, parking it carefully at the edge of Ruth's driveway. She came to the door in a wool coat with her hands together and her expression carefully composed. Ruth noticed she had been crying recently. The puffiness around her eyes was unmistakable to a woman who had spent 31 years looking at faces. Ruth brought her in and she offered coffee. Patricia sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said. "Go ahead." Patricia Loomis was 47 years old and had worked in the county recorder's office for 18 years. She was meticulous, reliable, the kind of public servant who knew every procedure and followed it because she genuinely believed that procedures were what made things fair. She was not a corrupt person. She had done a corrupt thing once 14 months ago, and she had been living with it since. She told Ruth what had happened. Dale Briggs had come to her office after hours. He had shown her the loan document. He had told her it needed to be recorded, that there was a timing issue, that the normal notarization process had encountered a small irregularity that would be resolved within days, and that it would be helpful if she could process the recording and stamp it with the office seal now. He had told her this was standard practice for certain time-sensitive financial instruments. He had been calm and authoritative and certain the way powerful men in small counties were when they needed someone's cooperation. And she had done it. She had processed a document she had not fully examined under time pressure, manufactured by a man she trusted and slightly feared. When the questions started, when Ruth had come into the office, Patricia had understood what she had done. She had said nothing. She had hoped it would go away. She had told herself it was a private financial matter between the bank and the Holden family, and that she had played only a procedural role. She had told herself a lot of things. Now she sat in Ruth's kitchen and said, "I know what you're going to say." "You don't know what I'm going to say," Ruth said. Patricia looked at her. Ruth looked back steady and direct. "I'm going to say thank you for coming. I'm going to say that what you did was wrong and that it hurt me and it needs to be corrected, but that you coming here to tell the truth about it is exactly the right next thing to do. And I'm going to ask if you'll provide a written statement to the attorney handling my case." Patricia's eyes filled. "I could lose my job." "You might," Ruth said honestly. "I can't promise you won't, but you could also lose your job by not coming forward when this unravels fully and it comes out that you were involved. The difference is that one of those outcomes ends with you having told the truth." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands again, then back up at Ruth. "I think I knew when he came to me that something wasn't right. I knew him well enough to know when he wanted something he shouldn't have. I wanted it to be routine. I wanted to believe it was routine." "People do," Ruth said. "That's how this kind of thing works. It relies on people wanting to believe it's routine." "I'm sorry," Patricia said. "For what it's worth, I know it doesn't fix anything." "It helps fix something," Ruth said. "That's worth something." She called Frank Riggs. He came over within the hour and took Patricia's statement in writing, formal and detailed, witnessed and signed. Patricia's hands were steady by the time she signed it, which Ruth noticed. There was something that happened to people when they stopped carrying a weight they'd been carrying too long. You could see it in their posture. Frank sent the statement to Weaver the same afternoon. By Thursday, Weaver called with news. The TBI had moved up their timeline. The combination of Patricia Loomis's formal statement and the existing evidence Weaver had presented had given them what they needed to escalate from a monitoring inquiry to an active investigation. They would be coordinating with the FBI field office in Knoxville given the federal dimensions of the mineral extraction scheme. Weaver said this is accelerating. He said stay steady and stay put. Cole had been on the property every day that week. He did not explain his presence in the way that someone would who was being charitable about it. He simply was there. He worked. He walked the fence line on the south field and identified 3 sections that needed repair and spent an afternoon with Tommy Blackwood fixing them without being asked. He brought firewood in from the pile at the barn and stacked it on the porch. He ate whatever Ruth put on the table with the same direct and unhurried appetite he had shown on the first morning. He talked to her in the evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while the fire settled and May's 7 o'clock call came and went. Not about the case, about other things. He told her about the Iron Saints, how the club had started as a veterans group 30 years ago and had evolved into something broader, still anchored in service, but open now to men who shared the code regardless of their service background. He told her about the code, the way you tell someone about something you believe in without needing to perform the belief. Ruth told him about Harold, about the early years of the farm, the years when money was short and the work was never done, and they'd gone to bed tired and gotten up tired and been too exhausted most of the time to be anything but honest with each other, which turned out to be the best possible foundation for a marriage. She told him about nursing school and the first years in the ER when she was young enough to think she could save everyone, and the slow accumulation of experience that taught you differently. That taught you the difference between saving people and keeping people company while they went somewhere you couldn't follow. Cole listened the way he always listened, completely, without the wandering attention you got from people who were waiting for their turn to talk. "Your father," Ruth said one evening, "he sounds like he was that kind of man." "He was," Cole said. "He was not perfect. He had a temper. He worked too much when I was young and was too tired when he came home. He was better when I was older than he was when I was a kid." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He got to be the grandfather my kids needed, which I think he understood was a chance to do it right. They loved him." "You have children, two daughters, 23 and 20, both in college now." He said it with a quiet pride that was nothing like performance. "Their mother and I didn't stay together, but we figured out how to raise them. That was what mattered." Ruth thought about what it meant to figure out what mattered. She thought about the 40 acres outside and the south field and the oak tree Harold had planted and the creek she had walked beside for 47 years. She thought about Dale Briggs and the 2 years of planning and the fraudulent signature and the pressure on the lawyers and the weight of a scheme designed to make her feel small and alone and outmatched. None of it had made her feel small. It had made her feel, if anything, more clearly herself than she had since Harold died. Like the pressure had stripped away the soft, comfortable layer of ordinary days and left her standing on something solid underneath that she had always known was there, but had not needed to access so directly in a long time. She was Ruth Holden. She had kept people alive through crises that would have broken other people. She had raised a son who struggled and loved him anyway, without pretending the struggle wasn't real. She had worked 40 acres of Tennessee ground with her husband and kept it going 4 years after he died, and would keep it going as long as her body would let her. She was not a person who could simply be taken. On Friday afternoon, the call came. It was Weaver. His voice was controlled and professional, but something in it was charged, something that told Ruth, before he said the words, that the situation had shifted. "The TBI and FBI executed search warrants this morning," he said. "Briggs's office at the bank and his personal residence. Sheriff Cobb's office as well. We're looking at arrest warrants within 24 to 48 hours. Ruth was standing at the kitchen window. The winter sun was going flat and cold in the south field. Harold's oak tree cast its long shadow across the snow. "And the properties," she said. "The foreclosure of our nation is suspended pending the criminal proceedings. Your title is not in immediate danger. The fraud complaint will be part of the criminal charges. This is not resolved, Mrs. Holden. It is going to take months of legal process. But the mechanism they used to threaten you has been exposed and stopped." Ruth breathed. She did not realize until that moment how much tension she had been carrying in her chest for the past 2 weeks. Not fear exactly, but a constant physical alertness, the physiological state of a person who is waiting for the next threat and does not know its form. Some of it released. "What about Jesse?" she said. "He's cooperated fully." Weaver's filing a motion that Jesse was a victim of the same fraud scheme, not a participant. "I believe that will hold. His account is consistent with Patricia Loomis's statement and with a forensic examination of the document." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. She thought about Jesse at the kitchen table wrapped around a coffee cup, telling her he'd signed papers he didn't understand. She thought about 43 years of Jesse and all the ways she'd loved him and all the ways she'd failed him and all the ways he'd failed himself, and the particular grace of this moment where his failure had not destroyed him and her love for him had not been swallowed by what he'd done. "Thank you," she said to Weaver. "I'll wait for your call." She hung up. Cole was at the kitchen table. He had been there when the call came in and had stayed quiet through it. He looked at her now, reading her face. "It's moving," she said. "I heard." She sat down across from him. The kitchen was warm. The fire in the living room was doing its slow, steady work. Outside, one of the Iron Saints men was visible in the south field, walking the fence line Cole had repaired, checking it in the late afternoon light. "What happens to your men?" Ruth said. "After this? You've all been here almost 2 weeks." Cole shrugged, a small, controlled gesture. "We're road people. We go back to our lives and we come back when we come back." He looked at her. Tommy Blackwood gished up in a place like this. He's been restless in the city for years. He asked me this morning if there was work in this county. Ruth looked at him. What kind of work? General kind, farm maintenance, engine repair. The kind of work a man with his hands does who needs to be useful and doesn't particularly care about commuting. Ruth thought about the barn roof panel that needed fixing, about the fence along the creek bottom that Bobby Tanner had been meaning to help her with since summer, about the south field that ran 40 acres and had always been better managed with two sets of hands. She looked at the window at the south field in the fading light. There's a converted storage building behind the barn, she said. It's got power and a wood stove. Needs some work, but it's sound. Cole was quiet for a moment. I'll let him know, he said. They sat together in the warm kitchen while the sun went down over the south field, and the 34-year-old debt between them worked itself out in the only way debts like that ever really do, not by paying, but by being transformed into something else entirely. Something that had no good word in English, but that both of them understood. Something that simply meant I am here. That evening, May Weaver came as she always did, and Ruth told her what Weaver had said. May sat across the kitchen table and listened with her hands folded, and when Ruth finished, she said, I want to tell you something I have been thinking about all week. Ruth waited. 50 years ago, May said, when I started at the county clerk's office, there was an older woman named Florence Aldred who had worked there for 30 years before me. She taught me everything about how that office worked. She said something to me in my first week that I have thought about ever since. May looked at her hands. She said the documents are not the truth. They are the shape that the truth takes when people decide to write it down. The documents can lie. What can't lie is the people who were there. Ruth listened. The people who were there, May continued, are you, and Patricia Loomis, and Jesse, and Bobby Tanner's son, who watched those survey men walk your field. All the people who were there when the truth is brought forward that is harder to forge than any signature. Ruth looked at her old friend across the table, her white hair and her sharp eyes and the 50 years of afternoons in each other's kitchens. You're right, Ruth said. I know I am, May said simply. Now make me some more of that tea before I drive home. It's cold out. The week that followed moved at the pace of legal proceedings, which is to say slowly, and at the pace of winter on a Tennessee farm, which is to say relentlessly. Ruth made her routines do the work they always did. She got up early, she cooked, she kept the fire. She walked the property when the weather allowed, checking on things, the barn, the fences, the creek, the way she always had. Tommy Blackwood started on the storage building behind the barn on Monday. He asked Ruth what she needed done, and she gave him a list, and he worked through it methodically the way a man works when he's given a real task and actually wants to do it well. He was quiet the way Cole was quiet, the particular quietness of people who had been in situations where noise cost something, who had learned to let the work speak. By the end of the week, he had re-insulated the storage building, fixed the wood stove's exhaust, patched the roof, and installed a proper deadbolt on the door. He asked Ruth if the second-hand cot in her barn was available. She told him to take it. He set it up in the storage building and moved his gear in, and that was how Tommy Blackwood came to live on the Holden property for the winter. A fact that Ruth reported to May on Thursday evening with a matter-of-factness that made May laugh for a long time. On the 15th day, Dale Briggs was arrested. Weaver called at 7 in the morning. Briggs had been taken into custody at his home the previous evening. Cobb had surrendered voluntarily through his attorney that same morning. The charges were multiple bank fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and in Cobb's case, abuse of official capacity and obstruction of justice. A man at the county recorder's office, who had assisted in the document processing, was also charged. Frank Hensley, the Nashville-connected principal behind Meridian Mineral Resources, had retained a law firm in Nashville and was cooperating with federal investigators in ways that Weaver said meant he was building his own defense by pointing at the people he had paid to deliver results. That was how these things tended to work, Weaver said. The middlemen went first. The architecture of who had asked for what became visible. Ruth listened to all of it with her hand flat on the kitchen table and the letter from Harlan County Savings and Trust on the table in front of her, the letter that had started everything, the letter with the forged signature at the bottom, that was not hers. The property, she said again. Your title is clear. The foreclosure action is formally withdrawn. The document in the county records will be corrected. I'd expect you to receive official notification within the week." She thanked him. She hung up. She sat for a while. Then she put on her barn coat and her wool hat and her heavy gloves, and she walked out the back door and across the yard and through the gate into the south field. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made everything sharp-edged. The tree lines dark against the pale sky, the snow crunching under her boots with a sound like paper. She walked to the center of the field, to the spot where the soil changed, where the brown-red surface gave way deeper down to that smooth, dense seam that ran toward the creek bottom. 40 acres. Harold's land, his parents' land before that. And before that, the first of the Holdens who had come to this part of Tennessee and looked at this ground and decided to put down roots. She stood in the center of the field, and she breathed the cold air, and she felt the particular quality of the cold, not hostile, not punishing, just the earth doing what it did in winter, drawing inward, conserving, waiting. She was not afraid anymore. She turned back toward the house. The sun was coming up fully now over the eastern ridge, throwing long gold light across the snow. Her footprints ran back toward the gate in a clean line. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm yellow glow of the light she'd left on. Tommy Blackwood was coming out of the barn with a length of fence wire in one hand, heading toward the creek bottom fence line. He raised a hand when he saw her. She raised hers back. She walked back toward the house. Spring came to Harlan County the way it always did, not all at once, but in the gradual and unconvincing way of a tentative thing that has been burned before and is not ready to commit. The first crocuses appeared in the second week of March, purple and stubborn, pushing up through the half-frozen earth along the porch foundation, where Ruth had planted them the year she and Harold moved in. She had planted them as a young woman, and they had returned every year since reliably, and without being asked, which was more than you could say for most things in this world. She stood at the kitchen window with her morning coffee and looked at them and felt the seasons shifting, the way you felt weather shifting when you had lived in one place long enough. Something in the light, in the air, and the quality of the cold that said, it was almost done, it was almost done. The legal proceedings moved at the pace of legal proceedings. Briggs had entered a not guilty plea, which Weaver said was expected and meant nothing about ultimate outcomes, only about the timeline. The preliminary hearings had consumed December and January. In February, a grand jury in Nashville had returned an indictment that expanded the original charges to include 2 additional counts of conspiracy in connection with the earlier property acquisitions, the Alderman Farm, and the properties of the 2 other families. The charges against Cobb had been separated into their own case but ran on a parallel track. Ruth went to one of the hearings in January, driven by May Weaver, because the roads were icy that day, and May had decided that Ruth should not drive on ice alone while there were legal proceedings happening about her property. Ruth sat in the gallery of the Harlan County Courthouse in her good wool coat, the charcoal one she had bought 5 years ago for Harold's funeral and had worn exactly 3 times since. She sat up straight the way she always sat. She watched Dale Briggs in his suit at the defense table across the room. He was smaller than he had seemed in her imagination of him. That was always the thing about the people who frightened you when they were abstract. When you got them into a room with other ordinary people, an ordinary light, and the routine furniture of a courtroom, they were just men. Just ordinary men who had decided that what belonged to someone else was theirs to take and had constructed the mechanisms to attempt it. He glanced at the gallery once, and his eyes moved across her face without recognition, or with recognition he was choosing to suppress. She couldn't tell which. She watched him for a long moment. Then she looked away because she was not interested in him in the way that he was not interesting, which was as a man. She was interested only in what the court would do. Weaver had been clear with her about the realistic expectations. The civil case, the restoration of her clear title, and the voiding of the fraudulent loan was effectively resolved. The criminal case was a different animal one that would take the better part of the year to move through the system. He cautioned her that outcomes in criminal fraud cases were not guaranteed, that juries were unpredictable and defense attorneys were skilled. He told her to be patient. Ruth was patient. She had spent decades being patient with things she could not control while working very hard on the things she could. The spring arrived fully in April. Bobby Tanner planted his fields on the first dry week, and the smell of turned earth came down from the north on the afternoon wind, one of the specific smells of spring in Tennessee that Ruth had loved her entire life, damp and mineral and alive. She got her kitchen garden in. She ordered seeds from the catalog that had arrived back in November, the ones she'd almost missed the day the bank letter came. She planted her tomatoes and her pole beans and her summer squash and the particular variety of sweet corn that Harold had grown for 40 years because his mother had grown it before him. Tommy Blackwood had become by this time a fixture on the property. In the way that certain things become fixtures, without anyone quite deciding they should, they simply prove themselves useful and then indispensable and then present. He had replaced the east side barn roof panel before the winter was out. He had repaired the creek bottom fence properly, all of it, not just the sections that were visibly failing. He had rebuilt the rotted step on the back porch and repointed the chimney and replaced the water heater when it finally gave out in February, in the specific miserable way that water heaters give out in February all at once and at an inconvenient hour. He did these things without being asked or without asking for anything beyond the cost of materials which Ruth paid and the use of the storage building, which she had told him was his for as long as he wanted it. He was a quiet man and a good worker, and he had the quality that Ruth most valued in people, after long acquaintance, which was that he was the same person at 8 in the morning as at 8 in the evening. You could rely on him to be what he was. Cole came back in April. He drove this time a truck pulling a trailer with his motorcycle on it. He was staying a week, he said, checking on things, checking on her. She put him in the guest room again. He fixed the drainage ditch on the south side of the property that had been directing water toward the barn foundation since fall. He and Tommy spent a Saturday regrading it with a rented machine, a project that would have taken Ruth and a hired hand twice as long and cost twice as much. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table and they talked. He told her about his daughters. The older one, Cassie, had just been accepted to law school. The younger one, Deanna, was studying environmental science, interested in land conservation, which made Cole smile when he said it in a way that suggested he found this choice of his daughters meaningful in a way he did not need to explain. Ruth told him about the spring, about the crocuses, about the corn. She told him she had been thinking about the south field, about what it meant that there was valuable clay under it, and about what she was going to do with that knowledge. She had spoken to a land conservation attorney that Weaver had connected her with a woman in Knoxville named Sandra Keller, who specialized in agricultural conservation easements. An easement would restrict certain kinds of use in perpetuity, which meant that the clay deposit would never be extractable by any future owner, and that the south field would remain what it was, which was agricultural land. Cole listened to this carefully. That reduces the property value, he said. Yes, Ruth said, considerably. You don't care about that. I care about that field staying a field, she said. What it's worth to someone who wants to mine it is not a number that interests me. Cole was quiet for a moment. My father would have understood that. I think Harold would have too, Ruth said. On a Saturday in late April, Cole drove out to Jesse's place. He told Ruth he was going, and she did not ask to come with him, and he did not invite her. This was right. Some things needed to happen without the complicated weight of a mother's presence. She went about her morning and she waited. Jesse had been sober since January. He had gone to a residential program in February, a 30-day thing, the first time in his life he had gone voluntarily rather than under pressure from someone else. He was living in his own place again, the double wide on Route 17, going to meetings 3 times a week in Pineville, working for a contractor named Aldrich, who was rebuilding the old feed store on Main Street. He called Ruth on Sundays. The calls were short and a little awkward, and she treasured each one in the specific way you treasure things that are fragile and hard-won. Cole came back in the early afternoon. He sat down at the kitchen table. He said Jesse was all right. He said Jesse had asked a lot of questions about the Iron Saints and the code, and how a man rebuilt something he had destroyed through his own weakness. He said Cole had answered those questions honestly, which meant not gently. Ruth poured him coffee. He asked about you, Cole said. What did you tell him? I told him you hadn't asked me to say anything to him, that what you said to him was going to come from you when the two of you were ready. Cole looked at the table. He said he didn't know if he deserved your time. Ruth wrapped her hands around her own cup. He is my son, she said. That is not the same thing as deserving. Cole looked at her. You'll call him this Sunday, he said. It was not quite a question. I call him every Sunday, she said. I have called him every Sunday since he was in the program. I just haven't said what needs to be said yet. She paused. I think this Sunday I will. He nodded. He drank his coffee. They sat in the warm kitchen while the spring moved outside the window, the south field green now really green, the new growth of the hay coming in along the fence lines and the creek trees fully leafed. Harold's oak tree in full presence, enormous and deeply rooted, and absolutely indifferent to anything Dale Briggs had ever wanted or planned. The trial was scheduled for September. The summer was the summer, which is to say it was hot and long and relentless. In the specific way of Tennessee summers, and Ruth moved through it the way she always moved through it early mornings in the garden before the heat set in, the slow, careful work of tending the afternoons with the fan in the kitchen, and her reading the evenings when the temperature dropped enough to sit on the porch and watch the fireflies come up from the south field. Tommy Blackwood had a rhythm now that matched the property's rhythm. He was up before her most mornings doing the early feeding in the barn and checking the fence lines before the dew burned off. She paid him a fair wage, which he accepted without argument, and he ate supper at her table 3 or 4 nights a week because that was easier than cooking for himself in the storage building. May came for supper on Tuesdays. Bobby Tanner stopped in on Thursdays sometimes, after he finished his own field work. The kitchen was full again. Not loud, not the loud it had been when the children were small, and Harold was at the table and the radio was on, and there were dishes and voices and the particular comfortable chaos of a household in full operation. That loudness was gone, and she had mourned it for years and was done mourning it. This fullness was quieter. It was the fullness of people who chose to be present rather than people who were simply there because they were family and had no choice. She found she preferred it. August was when the thing happened that she had not expected. It was a Sunday afternoon, 2 days before the trial was set to begin, and Ruth was on the porch with her tea and her seed catalog for the following year, which she kept out of habit even though the ordering season was months away, when she heard motorcycles on Route 9. Not one or two, many. She set down her catalog and watched the road. They came in a column 2 by 2, filling Route 9 from the shoulder to the center line, motorcycle after motorcycle, turning into her driveway. She counted them as they came. She counted to 34 before she stopped counting and just watched. Iron Saints vests. All of them. Men of various ages and builds and faces, some of whom she recognized and most of whom she did not. Cole was at the front. He pulled up to the porch and killed his engine, and the column behind him shut down in a cascading sequence, engine by engine, until the only sound was the creak of metal cooling and the birds in Harold's oak tree. Cole came up the porch steps. He stood in front of her, this large, quiet man, with the gray eyes and the service tattoo, and the plain white card he had given her in the driveway in November, and he said, "We wanted to be here for the trial." Ruth looked at the 34 men in her driveway. "You came all this way," she said. "You are our people," Cole said simply. She did not cry. She had cried exactly twice in the course of this whole thing, once in May's kitchen in December, when the weight of it had caught her sideways, and once alone in the South Field in January, when the cold was at its worst, and she had missed Harold with a physical acuteness that had surprised her. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to cry now on her own porch in front of 34 motorcycle club members. She said, "I better put more coffee on." The driveway and the yard and the south edge of the porch filled with Iron Saints men, doing what men did when they arrived somewhere, checking in with each other, smoking, stretching, after the road, talking in pairs and groups. Tommy Blackwood materialized from somewhere and began directing people to the water spigot by the barn and the outhouse at the back of the property with the ease of a man who had been managing logistics his entire life. May arrived at 4 o'clock, took in the scene from her car window for a moment, then got out, gathered her pot of soup from the back seat, and walked to the back door as if 34 motorcycles in Ruth Holden's driveway were exactly as routine as anything else. "I made extra," she told Ruth in the kitchen. "How much extra?" "Not this much extra," May admitted, "but we'll figure it out." They figured it out. Ruth made 2 skillets of cornbread. May's soup went into the big pot on the stove. Tommy Blackwood drove to the store in Pineville and came back with bread and cold cuts and enough food to supplement what they had. People ate in shifts, some inside, most outside on the porch, and the yard plates in their laps, the warm August evening coming down around them. Ruth sat on the porch steps and ate her supper alongside a man named Vance Gallagher, who had ridden from Louisville, who had been with the Iron Saints for 8 years, who told her about his wife and his 2 boys and the small engine repair shop he ran, in the particular way he had found the club after his military service as a structure that made sense to him when other structures did not. She told him about the ER, about the years of it. He was a good listener. She thought he would probably be a good father. The evening settled. Voices lowered. Someone had a small portable speaker, and there was music low and country, the kind of music Harold had always liked. The fireflies came up from the south field. Cole sat down next to her on the porch steps when the evening was well along. They were quiet for a while. "My father would have liked you," Cole said. "You've said that before." "I know, I keep thinking it." Ruth looked out at the yard at the mist settled in the warm evening, at Harold's oak tree at the edge of the south field, solid and enormous and permanent. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I said. When you asked me in November if I needed help, I said I didn't have anyone else to call, but I want to correct that. I had people I could have called. Bobby Tanner, May, the pastor, I had people." She paused. "What I mean is that you were the right call, not because you were the only option, but because you were the right one." Cole looked at her. "Because of your father," she said. "Because of what he told you. Stay legal, stay coordinated. Because a man who was raised to believe that the right thing to do is stop for someone on a bad road passes that along." She looked at her hands. "You stopped. That's what I needed. Someone who would stop." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You stopped first," he said. 33 years before I ever pulled into your driveway." The trial ran for 11 days in September. Ruth went every day. She wore the charcoal wool coat on the first day and then switched to her good blue one because the September weather was unpredictable and the charcoal was too heavy by afternoon. She sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the full, steady attention she brought to everything. She testified for 4 hours on the third day clearly and precisely the way she had always presented information in sequence, without drama, without excess. She was on the stand when the defense attorney asked her whether she was certain the signature was a forgery. She looked at him steadily. "I have signed my name," she said, "approximately once a week since I was 12 years old. That is 60 years of Sundays and Mondays and Tuesdays and all the other days. I have signed tax documents and medical records and property agreements and birthday cards and check registers. I know my signature the way you know your own face in the mirror." She paused. "That signature is not mine." The attorney asked if she had any documentary training in handwriting analysis. "I have 31 years of nursing training," she said, "which required me to read and interpret documents accurately under conditions of significant stress. I am familiar with the difference between careful examination and assumption." Another pause. "I examined that signature carefully. It is not mine." The courtroom was quiet. Gregory Weaver at the plaintiff's table did not look at her. He didn't need to. She could see from the slight quality of stillness in his posture that she had said what needed to be said. The verdict came on a Thursday. Darrell Briggs guilty on all counts. Wayne Cobb guilty on 3 of 4 counts. The deputy who had assisted with the document recording guilty on 2 counts. Sentencing was scheduled for December. Ruth received the news from Weaver by phone standing in her kitchen in the late afternoon. She said thank you, and she hung up, and she stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking out at the south field in the September light, the hay still green, the creek trees turning at the edges. She went outside. She walked through the gate and into the south field. She walked to the center of it, to the same spot she had walked to in January, when the cold was at its worst and the case was just beginning, and she had stood here in the snow and breathed and held herself together. The ground under her feet was warm now, the warmth of the end of summer still held in the earth even as the air cooled. She could feel it through the soles of her boots. 40 acres, the south field and the creek bottom and the pine stand on the ridge and Harold's oak tree at the edge of the yard, 47 years of Holden work and Holden love and Holden stubbornness pressed into this ground. She stood there for a while. She breathed. The conservation easement had been filed in August. It was recorded now in the county records office filed by the new deputy recorder because Patricia Loomis had resigned in April and moved to her sisters in Murfreesboro. The easement was permanent. The mineral deposit under the south field would never be extracted. The field would always be a field. She walked back through the gate and into the yard and up the porch steps. Tommy Blackwood was coming out of the barn. He saw her face and he read it the way people who are paying attention read the face of people they know. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded. He went back to what he was doing. She went inside and called May. May came over. She brought a bottle of wine, which she almost never did because May kept a mostly dry house on principle, but understood the appropriate exceptions. They sat at the kitchen table, and Ruth told her about the verdict, and May poured 2 glasses, and they sat with them for a while without drinking, just sitting with the fact of it. Harold would have, May started and then stopped. He would have been annoyed that he missed it, Ruth said. He would have wanted to have been here for the whole thing, and he would have been annoyed that he missed it, and then he would have pretended to be fine about it. May laughed. It was the right kind of laugh. They drank the wine. In December at sentencing, Briggs received 7 years in a restitution order that covered the legal costs of the families whose properties had been taken under the scheme the aldermans included. Cobb received 4 years and lost his pension. The Nashville-based principals of Meridian Mineral Resources were the subject of ongoing federal proceedings that Weaver said would take 2 more years to resolve. Ruth did not go to the sentencing. She had said what she needed to say. The courtroom was not the place that mattered to her. The place that mattered to her was at the kitchen table on a Sunday in December when Jesse came for dinner. He came at noon. He brought a pie which he had made himself in a clumsy and earnest way that she recognized as the pie of a man who does not cook much, but who understood that arriving empty-handed was worse than arriving with a bad pie. It was a sweet potato pie, slightly lopsided, the crust rough at the edges. She put it on the counter and thanked him for it with complete sincerity. He looked better than he had in years. Not recovered. She knew better than to think of it as recovered. You did not recover from the particular damage Jesse had done to himself over decades the way you recovered from a broken bone. But he looked present. That was the word. Present in his own face. They ate the lunch she'd made. They talked about the contracting work, about the feed store renovation on Main Street. He talked about his sponsor at the meetings, a man named Rufus, who had been sober for 22 years and who had the particular authority of someone who had done the thing the hard way and was available to help others do it. After lunch, Ruth brought out the pie and cut 2 pieces. She sat across from him and said, "I want to tell you something." Jesse looked at his pie. "What they did to you was deliberate," she said. "They identified you as my weak point, and they used you as a tool. That is not excusable. But neither is it the only thing that happened." She looked at him. "What you did after, when you were given the chance to tell the truth, that is also not the only thing that happened. You told the truth. You did it when it cost you something." Jesse was very still. "I'm not going to tell you it cancels out," she said. "It doesn't cancel out. But it matters. The truth you told matters. I want you to know that I know that." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I've spent 40 years disappointing you." "You've spent 40 years being who you are," she said, "which includes some disappointing and some things that are not disappointing at all. You are my son. Both things are true." He looked at his hands. He looked up at her. "I'm going to try to be better," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you are." They ate the pie. It was actually good. The filling was right, even if the crust was imperfect, and she told him so honestly, and he looked at her with something that was almost a smile and said, "Tommy Blackwood gave me the recipe. He said to tell you he learned it from some woman in Knoxville who ran the best diner in eastern Tennessee." Ruth set down her fork. She looked at her son across the table, and she thought about all the years and all the ways they had failed to say to each other what needed saying, and she thought that maybe this was one of the graces of getting older, that you reached a point where the things left unsaid became more costly than the awkwardness of saying them. She thought about Tommy Blackwood in the converted storage building behind her barn, a man she had not known existed a year ago, who was now as much a part of the rhythm of this property as the south field or Harold's oak tree or the creek running behind the barn. She thought about how the people who came into your life when things broke open were sometimes exactly the people who needed to be there, that the breaking and the arrival were part of the same thing. She thought about 34 men who had ridden a long road to eat cornbread in her yard. She thought about a young woman named Patricia Loomis, who had come to her door ashamed and had left with her spine a little straighter. She thought about May Weaver with her extra soup and her 50 years of showing up. She thought about a man named Ray Decker, who had called his son from a hospital in 1993 and told him to remember the people who stopped. She thought about all of it, and she thought that the world was full of people trying to do right by each other in the ways available to them, and that this was the thing Del Briggs had not understood and could never understand that the thing he had tried to take from her was not 40 acres or $180,000 or refractory clay. He had tried to take her sense of herself as a person who was connected to other people who mattered to other people, who had spent a lifetime building something invisible and sturdy and real. He had failed completely. Ruth thought about Tommy Blackwood in the converted storage building behind her barn, making sweet potato pie and sharing the recipe with her son. She thought about the 34 Iron Saints men eating cornbread and soup in her yard in August. She thought about Gregory Weaver and Frank Riggs and May Weaver with her extra soup and Bobby Tanner and his son, who had watched the survey crew, and Clara Brixton, who had come to the meeting with iron in her spine. She thought about all the people who had been there. After Jessie left, she walked out into the yard. It was a cold evening December, cold the real kind. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that made the air feel clean and sharp, like something you could cut with. Harold's oak tree stood at the edge of the yard, against the dark sky, its bare branches making their winter lattice. She stood in the yard for a while. She thought about November a year ago now, the night of the storm and the motorcycle and the man in the ditch. She thought about what she had not known then, about what was coming, about the 2 weeks of fear and the months of legal proceedings and the days in the courthouse and the 34 men in her driveway in August. She thought about Jessie's pie on her kitchen counter and the conservation easement in the county records and Tommy Blackwood's light in the storage building window. She thought about the things you built without knowing you were building them. Cole called that evening. She told him about the sentencing and about Jessie's visit. He listened the way he always listened. "How are you?" he said when she was done. She thought about it. "I'm good," she said. "I'm actually good." She heard something in the silence on the line, that particular not quite a sound that was his version of satisfaction. "Good," he said. She was standing at the kitchen window. Outside, the cold had settled fully, and Harold's oak tree stood in the starlight, permanent and deep-rooted, and exactly where it had always been. The south field was dark and still, 40 acres of Holden ground that would stay Holden ground, that the conservation easement meant made permanent in the county records, that no scheme and no forged signature and no man with a spreadsheet and a quiet bank office could take. She looked out at it. She thought about her father, who had told her when she was young, "You do not own land. You are its keeper for a while. What you do while you are keeping it is what you leave." She thought about what she was leaving. The easement, the field, the crocuses along the porch foundation, the storage building where Tommy Blackwood kept a light on, the kitchen table where her son had eaten pie on a Sunday. She thought about the desk at Harlan County General where her name was still on a plaque in the hallway near the ER entrance. A small plaque they had put up when she retired with her name and the years, and a phrase that one of the young nurses had suggested and that she had always thought was too much, but which tonight, standing at the window, with Cole's voice quiet on the phone and Harold's oak tree in the winter dark, seemed exactly right. She was there when it mattered. Outside, the cold deepened. Inside, the kitchen was warm. She had everything she needed. She always had. The crocuses would come again in March. The corn would go in May. The south field would come up green the way it always did, the way it had every spring for 47 years, the way it would continue to do after her, because the land endured, and the things planted in it endured, and the truth endured, even when small men with spreadsheets and forged signatures tried to fold it up and put it somewhere dark. The truth endured. Ruth Holden endured. Some things do not need words. But if you are the kind of person who stops on a bad road in the dark, who drapes a blanket over a stranger's shoulders, who holds a man alive on a freezing highway for 11 minutes because that is simply what needs doing, you already know that. You already know it in your hands. The following spring, Cole brought his daughters. He did not announce it as a significant occasion. He called on a Thursday and said he was coming up Saturday, and that Cassie and Deanna wanted to come along if Ruth didn't mind, and Ruth said she didn't mind. She said there was room and to bring appetites. They arrived in 2 vehicles, Cole's truck and a small sedan that Cassie drove with Deanna in the passenger seat. The daughters were what she had expected from the way he talked about them, which was to say they were their own full people, bearing some resemblance to their father in the way of the eyes and the directness of attention, but entirely themselves. Cassie was 23, starting her first semester of law school in the fall, with her father's measured way of listening and a quality of focused intelligence that reminded Ruth of the best nurses she had ever worked with, the ones who could hold 10 pieces of information simultaneously and make the right decision quickly. She asked about the conservation easement at lunch, and Ruth explained it, and Cassie asked two more questions that were good questions, specific and practical, and then said that conservation law was something she had been considering as a specialization, and that this case, the Holden case, was actually being discussed in one of her pre-law readings about community land protection. Ruth looked at her. "My case is in a reading." Cassie smiled, and it was her father's almost smile, the corner of the mouth close enough. "It's in a law school newsletter article. Gregory Weaver wrote it. It's about the use of coordinated fraud complaints across multiple plaintiffs to create pressure on county-level officials." She paused. "He uses your testimony as the central example of effective lay witness presentation." Ruth thought about she thought about sitting in the courtroom and saying, "I know my signature the way you know your own face in the mirror." And she thought that if Gregory Weaver had found that useful, then it had been the right thing to say, which was all she had tried to do. Deanna was 20, studying environmental science, as Cole had said, and she had something different from her father and her sister, something more openly emotional, more willing to be moved by things and to show it. She walked the south field with Ruth after lunch, the two of them moving along the fence line, while Cole and Cassie and Tommy Blackwood talked engines at the barn. Deanna asked about the clay deposit. Ruth explained what she knew of it, which was considerable. By now, she had spent several hours reading about refractory clay and its industrial uses the way she had always read about things she did not know carefully and until she understood them. Deanna listened, and then she said, "Do you ever wish you had just sold it? Taken the money and somewhere easier?" Ruth walked a few steps before she answered. "This is my land," she said. "Not in the legal sense, or not only in the legal sense. My husband's parents farmed it. Harold's grandfather cleared the south field. My crocuses come up along the porch foundation every March because I planted them when we moved in, and they've been coming up every March for 47 years. She paused. "You can't move a crocus and have it mean the same thing in a different yard." Deanna was quiet for a moment. "My dad talks about this place," she said. "He's talked about you since November. He talks about you like," she paused, "like you're someone he needed to know. Does that make sense?" Ruth looked at Harold's oak tree at the edge of the yard, enormous and bare-branched. Still the first green of spring, just beginning to bud at the tips. "Your grandfather told him to remember the kind of person who stops," she said. "I think he's been looking for that person his whole life. Maybe to thank her, maybe to become her." She looked at the young woman beside her. "What he's become doesn't need my thanks. He did the becoming himself." Deanna looked at the field. "He's the best person I know," she said simply. "He's one of the best people I know," Ruth agreed, "and I have known a great many." They walked back to the house. May came for supper and brought her soup, which she had doubled without being asked, because May always knew when to double the soup. Bobby Tanner stopped in with his son, who was 18 now, and about to graduate high school, and had a scholarship to the agricultural program at UT Knoxville, and who shook everyone's hand with the gravity of a young man who understood that this was a room full of people worth knowing. They ate at the kitchen table and on the porch and in the yard the way they had in August. The way Ruth was beginning to understand was simply how this house worked now more fully than it had for a long time, full in the particular way of people who chose to be there. After supper, in the long, slow light of a May evening, they sat on the porch. Cole was on the step below Ruth's chair. His daughters were in the yard talking to Tommy Blackwood about something Ruth couldn't hear. May was on the porch swing with her tea. Bobby Tanner's son had gone home, but Bobby himself had stayed sitting in Harold's old chair that Ruth had carried outside for the occasion. The fireflies were starting to come up from the south field. Ruth watched them rise, the slow green pulses ascending into the darkening air, the south field breathing light upward into the evening, the way it had always done on spring nights, the way it would continue to do. She thought about Harold. She thought about him in the particular way she had learned to think about him over 4 years, not with the full weight of grief, but with the lightened version of it that came with time, something that sat alongside love rather than underneath loss. She thought he would have been in this chair on this porch watching the fireflies come up, and that he would have had something dry and accurate to say about the previous 6 months, and that his saying it would have made her laugh. She missed his laugh. She thought she would miss it as long as she was living, and that was all right. You did not stop missing people, you just made more room. Cole turned his head and looked up at her from the lower step. "You all right?" he said. "I'm all right," she said. They watched the fireflies. The Iron Saints MC held a formal meeting 2 weeks later at their chapter house in Knoxville. Ruth did not know about this until Cole called her afterward. He told her the chapter had voted to make the Holden property an official designated place of refuge, which was a designation in their code that meant it was recognized as a place where any member could find shelter and assistance if they needed it, and that the chapter took responsibility for its safety. It was, he explained, the highest formal recognition the club gave to someone outside the membership. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I'm honored," she said, "truly." "You earned it," Cole said, "several times over." "What does it mean in practice?" "It means if you ever need us, you call and someone will come. It means we'll check on the property twice a year whether you ask or not. And it means Tommy stays as long as he wants to stay." "Tommy was going to stay regardless," Ruth said. "I know," Cole said. "This just makes it official." She thought about official things, about documents recorded in county offices, about easements and fraud complaints and verdicts, about the small metal plaque at Harlan County General near the ER entrance with her name on it, about the loan document with the forged signature that had been formally voided and removed from the county records, an administrative correction documented in January, a small and bureaucratic thing that had nonetheless required her to sign her actual name on an affidavit confirming it, and which she had done with the particular satisfaction of a woman signing exactly what she intended to sign. The official things mattered. She had spent her career generating official things, medical records and care plans, and incident reports because the official record was how you protected people when memory failed or motives shifted. She believed in official records. She also believed in the things that were true before and after the official record, the things that did not require documentation. A man stops on a bad road. A woman does not let someone freeze. A son tells the truth when the truth is hard. 34 men ride a long road to be present when it matters. These things were true before they were official and would be true after every document associated with them was lost or destroyed. That was the nature of the kind of truth that accumulated in the lives of people who paid attention and showed up. Ruth Holden had been paying attention and showing up for 72 years. She intended to continue for as long as she was able. In August, the canning season, she put up 47 quarts of tomatoes, one for each year. She did this with May's help and Tommy Blackwood's bemused tolerance, the two older women working the canning process in the kitchen, while Tommy kept the fire going in the outdoor burner they used for the big batches. It was a hot day's work, and at the end of it, the jars lined up on the counter in the fading afternoon light, red and sealed and perfect. May took 12 of them home. Ruth gave 6 to Bobby Tanner. She set aside a case for Tommy. The rest she stacked in the cellar the way she had stacked them for 47 years, the shelves her father-in-law had built with lumber from the old barn, still solid, still holding. She stood in the cellar with the lantern and looked at the jars. She thought about 47 years of summers and 47 years of canning and the particular persistence of small, repeated things, how they accumulated into a life, how the life accumulated into a place, how the place accumulated into something that was more than property, that was more than acreage, that was the specific and irreplaceable record of a particular human presence on a particular patch of earth. This was what Dale Briggs had not understood. He had looked at 40 acres and seen a transaction. He had not been able to see what 47 years of Sundays look like when you stack them up. He had not been able to see the weight of a crocus that comes back in March without being asked, or a jar of tomatoes in a cellar built by a man who had been dead 30 years, or an oak tree planted by a man who wanted to watch it grow and had gotten to watch it for 43 years before he ran out of time. That weight was not on any balance sheet. It was real anyway. She turned off the lantern and went upstairs and put on the kettle and called Cole Decker to tell him the tomatoes were done, and she was setting a case aside with his name on it, and he said, "Thank you." And she said, "You're welcome," and that was all that needed to be said, because some things were like that, whole and complete, in the simplest words, needing nothing added. Outside, Harold's oak tree stood in the August evening. The south field was green. The fireflies rose. The following November, on the anniversary of Cole's accident on Route 9, he rode out to the property again. He came alone this time, just the motorcycle and the road in the cold. He pulled into the driveway in the late afternoon, and Ruth heard the engine from the kitchen and put the coffee on before he knocked. He came in and took off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. The hook where Harold's barn coat had hung for 43 years, and sat down at the table the way a man sits in a place where he knows he is welcome. She poured coffee. She sat across from him. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. Outside, the cold was settling in the way it had a year ago, the temperature dropping as the afternoon ran out the sky, going the particular white that preceded serious weather. The weather forecast was for clear, but Ruth had lived in Tennessee long enough to know that the forecast was an opinion, and the sky was the fact, and this sky had the look of a sky that was holding something back. You worried about another ice storm, Cole asked. He said it with the almost smile. I'm never worried, Ruth said. Prepared. There's a difference. There is, he said. They drank coffee. They talked about Cassie's law school progress, about Deanna's research project on mineral rights and conservation easements in Appalachian counties, which had Ruth's case as a central data point, and which Cole said Deanna treated with a seriousness that suggested personal investment. They talked about Jesse, who had 14 months of sobriety now and had started going to Bobby Tanner's church, which was not the church Ruth went to, but was close enough in all the ways that mattered. They talked about Tommy Blackwood, who had asked Bobby Tanner's son to teach him about the hay operation, and who was by most measures now more competent about the South Field than anyone except Ruth herself. They talked about May, who had been diagnosed in September with a condition in her knee that would require surgery in the winter, and who was already negotiating with her surgeon about the timeline so that it would not interfere with the canning season, which the surgeon found less reasonable than May did. Ruth told Cole about a conversation she'd had in October with a young woman who had come to the door, a nursing student from the community college in Pineville, who was doing a project on retired local healthcare workers. The student had asked her about her career and about what she would tell a new nurse, and Ruth had thought about it carefully before she answered, which was that she would tell them that the most important thing was to be present, actually present. Not performing presence, but actually being in the room with the person who needed you. Because that was what made the difference at the margins, and it was always the margins that mattered. Cole listened. That's what you did, he said. On I-40, you were present. I was, she said. It wasn't complicated. The road was icy, and there was a man who needed help. That was the entire calculation. Most people drove past. Most people were afraid, she said. Fear makes you calculate. When you're afraid, you add up what it costs you to stop and subtract it from some imagined future benefit, and you decide the numbers don't work, and you keep driving. She looked at her coffee cup. I learned early not to make that calculation. Once you make it, you tend to keep making it, and eventually you don't stop for anyone. Cole was quiet. My father didn't stop for people either, he said, until he needed someone to stop for him. Then he spent the rest of his life thinking about it. He looked at her. He changed after I-40. He was different, more present, I guess. He started noticing things. People often do, Ruth said, after something interrupts the ordinary run of their life. The interruption is uncomfortable, and then it's clarifying. Is that what this year was, an interruption? Ruth thought about it. No, she said after a moment. This year was a continuation. I have been stopping for people my whole life. I have been trying to keep things alive. This was the year someone tried to stop me, and I found out that there were enough people around me who believed in the same things I believed in to make it impossible for them to succeed. She paused. That's not an interruption. That's a confirmation. Cole looked at her across the table. Yes, ma'am, he said. She refilled the coffee. The light outside the kitchen window was going gold and flat, the particular winter evening quality that softened everything, the bare trees and the snow on the south field and Harold's oak tree, making its long shadow across the yard. In the storage building behind the barn, Tommy Blackwood's light was on. The kitchen was warm. Stay for supper, she said. I was planning on it, he said. She got up and went to the stove. She made the supper the way she always made supper, with attention and without hurry, the way she had approached every task worth doing in her 72 years on this earth. The sound of the burner catching, the smell of the oil heating, Cole's voice behind her saying something about Deanna's semester, something about Cassie's moot court practice, the ordinary news of two daughters growing into themselves in the world. Ruth listened and stirred and thought about ordinary things, about the seed catalog on the counter and the crocuses coming in March, in the particular way the south field looked on a clear morning in May, when the hay was tall and the light came flat across it from the east, and then Everything was exactly what it was and nothing more and nothing less. She thought that was enough. She had always thought it was enough, even in the years when she had not said so out loud. Outside, the cold settled over Harlan County, over the south field and the creek bottom and the pine stand on the ridge, over the converted storage building and the barn with its fixed roof panel and the kitchen garden sleeping under its mulch, over the crocuses along the porch foundation dormant, waiting absolutely certain of March. Ruth Holden made supper. She had always made supper. She would make it tomorrow and the day after that for as long as she was standing and the stove was lit and there were people worth feeding. And when she could no longer stand, she trusted the people she had built around herself to carry what needed carrying, the way she had always carried what needed carrying for other people. The way the best things in this world moved hand to hand, generation to generation, cold road to warm kitchen, stranger to neighbor to family. She did not own any of this. She was its keeper for a while. That was enough. That had always been enough.